speaker series. I'm Jason Ng. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at CIFA Project University College Cork in Ireland, and today I'm hosting with co-organizer Mary Fogarty, a BGO and professor from the University of Toronto, Canada. Big thanks to Hannah George Wheeler for always showing up and helping us out behind the scenes with moderation and all the, letting people in and all the Zoom stuff. Yeah, I'm going to keep my part relatively short today and hand it over to Mary since I'm presenting.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it's really good to see everyone this morning. I am here in Newmarket, Canada, which is not too far from Toronto. And it's the traditional home of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people. And I'm really grateful to be here today with all of you. This speaker series is a platform for researchers studying the important cultural moment of breaking at the Paris Olympics in 2024. And Jason and I intended this series to really open up a conversation between researchers, practitioners, and the general public to share knowledge. And since this is our second last one, I have to say, I think it's been quite a success in bringing together different communities and, giving people more access to what kind of research is out there and giving a platform for people to share their research in progress. The research in progress is for a special issue on breaking in the Olympics that will be published in the journal Global Hip Hop Studies. And we've got Griff Rolifson with us here today, who's one of the founding editors. So we just want to thank him and Adam Hopt for allowing us this opportunity to really go deep into breaking. A lot of hip hop research doesn't really think about dance. So it's been really wonderful to have this international platform to foreground what matters to the dance community right now. So thank you. The presenters submitted abstracts to be part of this special issue, and many of the presenters are in their early days of research. So this is a practice space for ideas. It's not the final word. Even though we're recording it, people's research will change as they get new information. So just to keep that in mind as we're presenting that's what this forum is for. In today's session, we'll be hearing a range of new research directions from across the globe. And our first presenter, I'm very pleased to introduce is Serouj Miduss Aprahamian. He's known as B-Boy Miduss. He made his name internationally when I think in 2001, you can correct me on the date, the Detours video came out and kind of blew everyone's mind with the kind of approach that you were taking to the dance and also what the dance means to you and your group of people that you were working with. So I know it was hugely exciting for me when that video came out and really felt like there were people that were asking interesting questions. So that was my introduction to you. So he's a longtime practitioner of breaking, popping, and underground hip hop dance styles. In 2021, he completed his PhD in dance studies from York University, writing a phenomenal PhD called Going Off, the Untold History of, I think, the early days of hip hop. I'll throw it in the link as well. Where he looked at the 1970s and just a really fantastic PhD. His scholarly writing has also appeared in the journal Black Studies, Dance Research Journal, and Oxford African American Studies Center. He was recently awarded a position at the University of Illinois. He'll be starting in in August. And we're so happy about that. Me as your former PhD supervisor, it's great to see people land positions that deserve them and have done so much work to be deserving of that role. So we're so excited that you've got the position and you'll be doing more of the fantastic work that you already started. So without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Wow, well, thank you, Mary. I really appreciate that. That means a lot. Yeah, thank you to you and Jason for giving us this forum. I think this dialogue is super important and, kind of echoing what was said already. This is definitely a work in progress for me. So, the topic I'm going to be presenting on is focused less on breaking actually, and more on the context in which breaking is being incorporated into the Olympics. So it's going to be a little bit of background on what has been happening with the IOC, the Olympics, and also other sports and activities that have been going into the Olympics through this process. So seeing if we could draw lessons and things like that, but it's very preliminary. I'm looking forward to the discussion more so than anything. So yeah, I look forward to questions and stuff. Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen first before I get started. hopefully everybody could see this. So, I mean, even from the title, just to give an example of how this is shifting and developing, even the title I have here, Breaking in the Olympic Strategy for Expansion, the more I research this topic, and the background to what's happening, the more I'm convinced it's not really, initially I assumed that what's occurring is the IOC is continuing to grow and, expand its hegemony as like the leading sports and, cultural festival, and trying to grow and capture new markets, and quote unquote. But really, the more I research it, the more I'm being convinced it's a strategy for survival for an institution that's declining and crumbling in a lot of ways. So that's not something super conclusive, but it's one of the issues I'm kind of looking at as I go through. But to get an idea of how breaking got incorporated into the Olympics, I think the first thing to do to start off is look at the IOC's business model. Can everybody hear me? Everything okay? Okay, cool. Sometimes you never know, it's virtual Zoom stuff, but yeah, I mean, the main business model, I mean, it's quite simple actually, is TV revenue. 75% of the IOC's income is generated from selling media rights to broadcasters, and the main benefactor that the IOC has in this relationship is NBC. So, for all the talk about Olympism and Olympic movement and all these values of bringing world peace and all these other things, countries together, I mean, really, this is a business geared toward out of TV revenue, having eyeballs watch screens. When people do that, advertisers advertise on those television screens. That's how people make money. So, NBC is a contractual partner of the IOC until at least 2032. So they have a very close relationship. And what's been happening is the eyeballs are not viewing Olympic screens. For the last decade or so, there's been declining ratings for the IOC. For example, the Summer Games, this is the average viewership of the Summer Olympics from 2008 to the last one in Tokyo in 2021, but they say 2020, COVID reasons, obviously. But in any case, you see the steady decline, and it's becoming sharper and sharper as the years go by. So, there's been a 52% decline from 2008 in average viewership. And 2008 was in Beijing, and Tokyo saw a 52% decline from that. In the Winter Olympics, same exact cycle. So 53% decline from 2010. This last one that just happened, very low numbers of people watching. So this is actually what in the Olympics world they're calling a crisis of relevance. And in addition to the ratings, I mean, there's another aspect to this, which is those not only are less people watching, but those who are watching tend to be older. The numbers are going up of people still interested in the Olympics and viewing it. The median age for the Olympics TV viewer now is in the low to mid 50s, whereas advertisers who advertise on NBC and other places, their key demographic is 18 to 34. So this is a big problem for the Olympics, and it's the motivating factor behind what's going on. At least I would argue, and I think it's pretty easy to demonstrate. But there might, obviously that's a generality, general statement. There's obviously other things, but this is like the core of the issue. So this process has been happening, at least since the late 2000s, early 2010s. And in 2013, the IOC elected a new president. His name is Thomas Bach. Thomas Bach is a former Olympian himself, but also, went on to be a marketing executive for Adidas. There's a lot more details to this. Because if you look at the history of Adidas' relationship with the Olympics, there's a lot of rich, interesting things, connections there. And if you just look at how the Olympics operates, that's a whole another story. It's a very opaque institution. But in any case, Thomas Bach got elected and, quickly consolidated his power. And then within a year of him being elected, he organized this report, which is called Agenda 2020, which is kind of like a guiding roadmap for the Olympics in the new era. And so, one of the main things behind this report was this crisis of relevance. Really that was the motivating factor even for the report itself. And so they have it, there's 40 recommendations in this report. um, categorized really under three like core factors. One is sustainability. So when we look at why are ratings declining, I mean, there's several kind of factors people point to. One of them is like the fact that cities are no longer interested in hosting the Olympics, especially cities in the West. And that's due for a whole host of reasons. A lot of the main one being the costs of hosting the Olympics. It's almost always above estimates what cities actually put in. There's a large carbon footprint, environmental footprint. You know, there's just a whole host of critiques of the cost cities have to incur to host the Olympics, and little benefits and little of the promised benefits actually accruing. So many cities are actually not even bidding, or certain cities have bid and then pulled out at the last minute. I mean, for instance, Oslo pulled out of hosting the 2022 Winter Olympics. They were geared to host it and then they pulled out because of these critiques from citizens and different things like that. And that's why the Olympics just got hosted in China. So you're seeing this process of the Western cities like not pulling out of it. And that's why you see things like Sochi and China, these countries more so gravitating towards hosting the Olympics, many people argue. So even with the upcoming Paris Olympics, it was the first time ever that the Olympics announced two cities, Paris and then later Los Angeles, at once. That was the first time that ever happened. And it was really not even a bidding process formally. It was kind of something that happened behind closed doors and was just announced. So that's a big part of this crisis of relevance, is the fact that hosting the Olympics and the glamour and glitter the past, you know, affinity cities might have had to bid and wine and dine Olympics officials to get them to come to their city is slowly decreasing. Another thing is credibility. You know, there's a lot of people who critique the IOC for corruption scandals, for obviously abuse scandals with the, you know, Gymnastics Federation issue, how they deal with these issues. Obviously athletes taking drugs and different and performance enhancement drugs. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people know these issues. So 23 out of the 40 recommendations are kind of geared towards these types of issues and reestablishing the IOC's credibility. And the final one, which actually only has 4 out of the 40 recommendations, and these are my estimations of what recommendation applies to what factor, although these factors are identified by the Olympics report in the introduction: sustainability, credibility, and youth. As this fourth and this third factor, I think, is actually the main factor driving, again, really what it comes down to is getting eyeballs to watch TV, basically, and so that you can get ad revenue from that. And these recommendations talk about blending sport and culture. A very interesting recommendation that talks about the IOC entering the strategic partnerships with recognized organizations and NGOs and groups outside of the IOC structural apparatus, revitalizing the Youth Olympics, launching an Olympic channel, and so forth. So again, my argument is that although only 4 out of those 40 recommendations talk about youth, really this is one of the main driving forces behind what's happening in the IOC and all these new additions, and especially with breaking. I think this is definitely the main motivating factor why the IOC is interested in breaking. So, you know, for the Paris 2024 pitch, this was a statistic put out there by the organizing committee that breaking has 1 million participants around the world. They added that there's over 6 million viewers and people who follow breaking. You know, whether we agree with the merits of these numbers or not, I mean, it's clearly geared towards this has a big viewership, you know, and especially among youth. And this first clip I'm about to play is from back in 2016 when breaking was announced as part of the Youth Olympics. There was an organization called UBA, United Breaking Association, and they seemed to kind of jump out into the public realm right away and start talking about the Youth Olympics when most people in the community didn't really know what was happening. And this is the explanation of one of their head figures about why this happened and what the IOC is looking for.
Very exciting. So let's take a step back and think about how did we get here? And so the Olympic movement has really been losing the younger demographics. And if you look at all the data from the television ratings and so forth, they're looking at different screens or multiple screens, but they're not looking at the screen that brings the Olympics the most money, which is where the sponsors are. So they're trying to figure out how to develop a younger audience, and that is how the Youth Olympics was created. It really started in 1998, but it took that long, probably 10 years, until they got it off the ground. Last year was the first.
So, again, this is just to reiterate how early on this was.
Well, breakdancing has been given.
This was the motivating factor. This is after the Paris Olympics announcements. You could just hear a quick quote from Thomas Bach himself. You know, actually, I'll refrain from showing this just for the sake of time, but it's just Thomas Bach, the head of the IOC himself, coming out saying how they're very interested in breaking for all these reasons, again, reiterating the youth appeal aspect of it. And other activities, sports that have been incorporated, one is surfing. And I think this is just, quickly to survey this to get a sense of the governance issues that are involved as new activities are kind of engulfed by the Olympics, what's been happening with other sports for us to learn from, or, I think this is a very interesting cultural process that there's a lot of lessons and interesting developments happening in. But on the governance issue, with surfing, interestingly enough, an organization called the International Surfing Association was the actual organization that has been pitching to get in the Olympics for decades. So they are indigenous to like that practice. So they organize competitions and they're recognized by practitioners as being from the community. So it wasn't much of a governance conflict. They had been wanting to get in the Olympics for a long time. So it was a close fit, and they brought in the World Surf League, which is like another major organization in the surfing competition world. So they've been working together, and it's been mostly kind of like an industry-led process. Industry meaning like the surf competition industry. With skateboarding, it was a little different. You had a roller skating organization called, I forget their acronym is FIRS, but they essentially have no connection to skateboarding. They're like a roller hockey, roller skating kind of organization that has no connection to the community. They're the ones who pitched or were given governance of it initially in the initial announcements. And this caused a major stir among skateboarders, and there was very strong pressure against that, and led by an organization called the International Skateboarding Federation. Long story short, I mean, they essentially pushed out first from dominating this governance process and brought in the ISF and like recognized figures from the skateboarding community, and they formed a new organization called World Skate, which first has representation on, but not majority voting power on. So they're almost like a symbolic presence there. And when first started talking about doing other activities, competitions outside of the Olympics, the skateboarders threatened to walk out from the whole thing and essentially squashed any ability for this outside entity to do any skateboarding competitions or have any involvement in skating actually beyond just symbolic representation in the Olympics. You have parkour, which has been pitched for Paris. Actually, there was a big push to get them there because parkour and free running come from France. And the parkour community has been mobilized, unified, opposing that. And they put out petitions. People have done all kinds of actions, and they've been like celebrating the fact that the IOC didn't pitch parkour for the Paris Olympics. They're bitterly opposed to being part of this process, and because the Gymnastics Federation was scheduled to or slated to be governing parkour, an entity that has no connection to that activity. So, there's obviously more details revolving around these processes. I know I'm short on time, so I just kind of want to wrap it up. But with the breaking community, I think what you've seen is tacit cooperation in comparison to these kind of 3 quick other case studies. I say tacit because I know, like, I've observed a lot of people involved in the process with the World Dance Sport Federation and the IOC. Their interest, a lot of people, is to protect the dance from this process, so to make sure that there are community involved people involved in the process. But nevertheless, the approach is generally, from my observation, my argument, been one of cooperation and even welcoming this process as an opportunity for new benefits and you know, money and sponsorship and things like that. But you know, I bring this point that we should, especially people in the breaking community, should realize that this is also in a context of a declining institution. So how much that'll succeed is also, it's important to discuss, you know, and also to think about issues of leverage as you approach these institutions and things like that. But beyond that kind of breaking centric view, I think this is an important case of a lot of institutions in the world today that are declining, you know, established institutions, whether we're talking about the Grammys or theatrical institutions or sports. I mean, there's a lot of similar processes and other aspects of life where we're seeing different initiatives to kind of hold on to some semblance of relevance, and how alternative expressions and forms are being co-opted or brought into those older institutions. And I think a very interesting process and phenomenon to study. I'll just keep it there because I feel like I'm probably over time, so I apologize.
That's great. Let me just, as promised, I'm just putting the PhD into the chat. We'll open it up to questions now. I know Nefeli had one. Nefeli, do you want to just ask it here, or do you want me to read it out?
I think he answered the afterwards, so it's okay. I think it was TV audience that he was referring to.
Yeah, it looks like Dalit has a question, and Jason. So I'll start with Dalit.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation, Serouj. You alluded to some of my question, your answer, I guess, at the very end of your presentation, but I'm curious for yourself personally, and maybe Mary, you want to chime in as well. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. As dance practitioners, professionals in the field, and as dance scholars, how do you feel about breakdancing being categorized as sport, or being put in the category of sport within the context of the Olympics? Obviously, there's benefits to the industry, but
yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I mean, one of the things that's been the central, very logically, I mean, it makes a lot of sense for that to be the main discussion point. I think that, from my estimation, that's like the main thing people in the community have talked about. It's an issue of concern. I actually don't think that's a big concern, to be honest, because the Olympics doesn't really care about sports. You know, I mean, they care about viewers because it's a money-making institution. So we shouldn't get too hung up on that. They're very openly saying that they're trying to mix culture and sports. They're openly saying we're not about sports. We want to integrate culture. So they want to attract youth. So if you turn the dance into a sport, and that might repel youth who are gravitating towards it for expressive cultural reasons, they don't want that, you know. So I think there is room for people involved in the Olympics process to really push the cultural aspect of it. Not to say that that's, you know, you just don't have power in the process. You know, you don't have contractual power. So what's going to happen 10 years from now, I think, is still relevant. And but me, I'm not so much concerned about the cultural expression part, especially there are like bona fide people from the community involved in it right now. Again, unfortunately, they're contractual consultants, just like the UBA was involved in the process in the beginning, and nobody knows where they are now, and they've been kicked to the curb by the IOC. That's a threat, you know, the lack of power, you know, that could happen to anybody involved right now too, in 10, 20 years from now, if it were to go that far.
Maybe I'll just add a point because Dalit said I could. Just in terms of Canada, the one advantage, I suppose, right now that we're finding with breaking is that we've now got access maybe to art funding and to sport funding. Unlike any other art, we've got access to some sport funding. So certainly for an art form that was not valued in Canadian culture for a very long time, when we had people representing internationally at breaking events, you know, we've got a huge history of phenomenal dancers from Canada that weren't funded or supported by anyone. So it's an interesting turn to see now that there's places to go for both art and sport funding now to support our next generation. So I think what Serouj said about that kind of tacit involvement of people and people trying to protect the scene, I think that's really, you can see that certainly in the projects we're doing that are run by B-boys and B-girls to support kind of younger generation here in this kind of Olympic moment, and how can we support them? So that's the interesting sport question there, that in some ways it's opened up some possibility right now for some kind of funding and support in ways that we haven't seen in the past. Jason, you're next, and then Roberta.
You've pretty much answered the question I had. I was sort of going to allude to the opening of markets and what that looks like. So that's cool. No worries. Roberta, go for it.
Hi, do you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much, Serouj. That was really great. You said something about putting leverage. I didn't quite understand that. Could you explain?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I'm kind of running through very fast. But yeah, one of the other things that I take away from this whole presentation, to me, that's central, is perception. Perception is the driving factor guiding a lot of this. I mean, the crisis of relevance the Olympics had is geared around branding themselves as sustainable, branding themselves as credible and transparent and youth-orientated and gender equality and all these things. So with the breaking community too, I think there's an issue of perception. The dominant perception out there is that this will bring in, there's even numbers thrown out, like $150 million in new revenue is going to pour into the community, that this is an opportunity for the community, that we'll get legitimacy finally. We won't have to hide who we are. Our parents will understand what we're doing and be proud of us, and governments and developing countries will support it. It's an issue of people thinking that this is helping us, when in reality, we're helping them. And we should approach it in that manner, just like any negotiating process, where I think there's factual reasons to think to realize that, not perceptual dreams or narratives or kind of this neoliberal discourse of like trickle down economics is going to trickle down to us. We should approach the issue factually and see that they're declining. They need these activities. That doesn't mean you take it from there. I mean, I'm not trying to negotiate with the Olympics myself. I'm just saying, I see this narrative in the community. I see very few dancers saying, no, the Olympics needs us, we don't need them. Whereas skaters, that is the narrative in the skating community. We don't need these guys, they need us. And that changes how you approach processes, I think. But that's just my personal subjective opinion.
Thank you for that. And we've got time for one more kind of shorter question. Cheryl Dodds, if you've got a question as well, or comment.
Yeah, thank you. I can make it super quick. So I really appreciate, Serouj, how much you've kind of dug deep into the practices of the IOC. And I was wondering if you found anything about like its expenditure and the extent to which it supports athletes like getting to the Olympics at all levels. Because I was thinking of a couple of months ago when Emil Jensen did his presentation, that was like this amazing breakdown of costs. So I was just wondering to what extent you feel that IOC does any support work in terms of its athletes.
Oh yeah, no, thank you for that question. I mean, great question. I don't have the numbers, so don't quote me, but one of the recommendations in the credibility factor of the Agenda 2020 is athlete support. And they emphasize a couple of recommendations related to that, because they've been critiqued heavily by the world for not supporting athletes, for actually exploiting athletes, because it's an amateur competition, but yet they want the best of the world and they don't pay them, and something like 4% of the money ends up trickling down to athletes. Is again, don't quote me on that, but it's a number along those lines. And a lot of Olympic athletes pay out of pocket to go to the Olympics, and there's a treasure trove of stories about this. And even with the breaking in the Olympics process, we can ask that question: how much are breakers benefiting? There's people, for example, the Youth Olympics, the Canadian B-girl who took second place, Emma, she had to go do a GoFundMe. Her parents supported her to go there. It wasn't the promoter bringing her out, which is usually what happens when you win a qualifier. Even in the breaking community, the promoter will fly you out, but she had to pay her own way. And that's a story many people involved in the Olympics have had so far. So that's not to down it, it's just to kind of look at these realities and think, well, yes, this might bring opportunity, but where can we tangibly point to how this? Plus, just the final point, the World Dance Sport Federation controls the funding. So you're under their whims. They're the final people who sign off on even how funding trickles down. And that's obviously a problem because they're not connected to the community. So you have people who have no connection to the dance. How are they going to have the knowledge to support the community? So these are like questions that, I think people involved in the process are asking themselves too as they get involved. So that's good.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. There are some other comments in the chat. So when you have a breather, Serouj, you might want to go in and maybe answer or respond. Our next presenter is Roberta Shapiro, who is a sociologist, and here's my bad French for a Canadian, at the Institut Interdisciplinaire d'Anthropologie de Contemporaine and the Centre de l'Emploi et du Travail en Paris. She researches at the intersection of cultural and historical sociology, with particular interest in art and work in hip-hop dance, outsider art, and cuisine. Her recent publications include Cultural Sociology, Special Issue on Artification, Volume 13-3 from September 2019. And just a word, Roberta Shapiro's work on artification and breaking is really phenomenal, thinking about how breaking gets introduced as an art discourse in France. And she was really, in my mind, one of the really early writers about breaking. So I've had the privilege of speaking with her, I think, gosh, it might have been 10 years ago now, on that kind of question about how it got framed as art in French society. So we're very happy to have you, Roberta, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And I've really been enjoying the whole series. It's really been intellectually stimulating, and it's great to be here. Thank you. So this is my current project. I'm starting to look into this. I'm not sure how this is going to go. It depends if I get a grant or I don't get a grant. And what is interesting is that I've started on like a project with two parts, and I was really interested to listen to Serouj because the first part of my tentative project sort of overlaps with what Serouj has presented, because what I hope to do is to, I have a project where my first part is, was the decision-making process that actually put breaking and the Olympics on, how did the idea emerge? And maybe at one point, Serouj, we can try and get together and see if our two projects can communicate, because my idea was hopefully to interview people at the IOC. And as you said, they're very closed. So I don't know if I'll actually be able to talk to them, because I know it's difficult. But my idea, the first part of my project would be to how did the idea actually come to be, and who are the people who got the idea? How did they get the ball rolling? How did the how was the decision made? Who furthered the idea? Who tried to promote it, and what were the actions taken for the decision to actually come to be? So that's the first part of the project, and I hope to go to Geneva and Lausanne and interview the people who actually were the actors of this whole project, and so that means people from the IOC and people from the World Dance Sport Federation, essentially. And the idea of, you did it on documentation, and I hope to do it more with the actual people who were important in getting things done. With my main idea being that they have common interests to some degree, and they also have conflicting interests. The World Dance Sport Federation main interest being that what they're interested in is promoting the category dance sport, and breaking being just a vehicle for dance sport. But dance sport is essentially competitive ballroom dancing, and not breaking. Breaking is just a vehicle for something else. And we'll see how that goes. And as you said, IOC, their problem is to cut spending and to get more people interested in the Olympics. As you say, it's going down. So that's the first part of the project. And but based on interviews and based on people's involvement rather than based on documents, which your project is based on. And the second part of my project is impact. And this part of the project would be based on the French context. What is the impact in France? And as you may know, the situation in France is somewhat different, is actually pretty different from what you probably know in North America. The hip-hop dance in France is, and this, I'm going beyond breaking here, hip-hop dance in general is, has very strong public support, government support. Since the 1980s, since it started, it has been has had in the beginning small support, but as the years have gone by, more and more government support from the townships, from the departments, the local governments, and then as the years have gone by, more and more government support. And so that's the one thing. And the second thing is, that's interesting to know, is that theatrical hip hop dance is very strong. And in the beginning, that was the strongest manifestation, if you will, of hip hop dance, was the theatrical, the ballet kind of hip hop dance. And there are many hip hop dance companies. And hip hop competition battles only started after the 2002. So essentially, hip hop dance in France is organized in two sectors: the theatrical sector and the competition sector. Then there's also commercial hip hop opportunities, but that started only very recently. And that means that hip hop dancers, whether they be breakers or poppers or house dance or whatever their specialism is, they are both artists and sports people, if you want. But when I say they are artists, they're not only artists because they feel like they're artists. They are artists in a very administrative sense. They are artists because they benefit by an unemployment scheme that defines them as artists. They're artists under the law. They have they benefit by an unemployment scheme that is open only to performing artists. Other people, a plumber or an accountant, does not benefit by that scheme. Only performing artists benefit by that scheme. So they are artists in a very legal sense, in a very administrative sense, which makes them makes that status very strong. It's not just that in their soul they feel that they're artists. They are artists for society, and they have that. They're defined in that manner by the administration. Social Security, the tax, in the tax form, they're defined as artists in that manner. And I would say that 80% or 90% of professional high-level hip hop dancers are both artists and competitors, and they move in the hip hop world, they move from competitions to the theater in a very ordinary manner. That's the way they work. They go from battles to theater companies in a very fluid way. That's how they work. They do both. So the main question here is how important is how important is the shift that the inclusion of breaking in the 2024 Olympics going to be in the French hip hop scene? Will the impact be a rift between artists and sports persons? Already there is a French national breaking team, as I suppose there are national breaking teams in other countries. And the 30 members of the French national breaking team now receive a stipend from the Ministry of Sports. They receive 1,500 euros per month as members of the team. So they are now on the road to become professional sports persons. Does that mean that they are now sports persons and not artists anymore? What does that portend for their future? Will they go back after the Olympics? Will they go back to the stage, or will they specialize as sports persons? These are really important questions. Is this a major change in the hip hop community for these people? Will they continue being multi-active, or are they going to be specialized sports persons from now on? Already there have been changes. There has been a sort of Zhursky, I think it was in January, he talked about the trivium, and he talked about quantification. That's a major change. The fact that a new rationalized judging system has been adopted, and possibly it will be adopted in all competitions, and there'll be a universal judging system, a rationalized judging system that will be adopted beyond the Olympics and will be used in all breaking competitions. Who knows? But it is there. And that is an interesting case of rationalization in the ways of doing things. That was already a trend that existed. It had already started in the large competitions, but it has been accelerated by the Olympics. There's this trend to professionalism that has started with the Olympics. Other changes have been introduced. There are more rounds now. So in the Olympics battle, there are more rounds than in other battles. There's the separation between men and women. So some changes have been introduced. So we will see. It is, but I think this main change, at least as far as French dancers are concerned, and it will be interesting to see if this is also affects other people from other countries. Will there be a split between, I'm not going to say between art and sport, but between artists and sports persons, because it's the people that are, I think it's more precise to talk about the people than between art as an abstraction and sports as an abstraction. Between the people, will people be specialized? I think this is an interesting question and something that we should follow. I think that's about it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roberta. And I think that's a profound question to shift the conversation from art versus sport to people, artists versus sportsmen. So thank you for that wonderful presentation. It looks like Alex has a question to start us off. Alex Harley.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm so curious just from the administrative point, as you say, like these individual people who are now on the payroll of sport, like what do their taxes look like, right? If they used to be in this category of artists and they had certain access to benefits or whatever, then like what does that look like for them if they had a certain expectation of the flow of their income or what have you, and now they have this different designation, and like how long does that last, I think, which is maybe a theme that's been running through everybody's presentations, the whole series, is like what is the lasting impact, or is this just a 4-year cycle where it impacts everybody for a couple years around it, and then there's an abandonment of, you know, these people and these structures in between. Yeah.
This is what I hope to find out with this through the survey. The idea is to have interviews with a few members of the French team in the coming weeks. I haven't interviewed them yet, so I don't know. I can't answer the question, but obviously that's a central question to the whole survey, is to talk to a few members of the French team. And so I have contacts, but I haven't interviewed them yet, so I don't know. I can't answer the question yet.
Roberta, I've got a question, just thinking back to your work as well in Artification, and then thinking about my own context in Canada of how performance studies as a field, it's not dance per se, but performance studies as a broader field, has really shifted from the fine arts of the past to thinking about how's cooking involved? How do we talk about roller skating? How do we talk about politicians performing? So I feel like performance studies in some ways has kind of broadened that scope. And I'm also thinking about how sociology has always had that kind of broader scope. In terms of your own work, because I noticed you also do cuisine and that kind of thing. In terms of the institutions in France, what support is there for breakers now in terms of, if you can answer this, in terms of where it fits in higher education, the academy, or do you see any kind of shifts going on with what gets artified, if I can use that word, or how does that artification process work now? And do you see any kind of shifts for breaking of where it lands above and beyond kind of the Olympic structure and funding for the national team?
I'm not sure I understand.
I don't know if I did either. I was just kind of thinking through in terms of higher education. So do you see our dancers getting hired for institutions to teach dance? Is it becoming legitimized in terms of higher education in France?
Higher education. Well, the whole education system is different. The question, there's been a lot of talk about, you see, dance and music are taught in conservatories. They're not taught in universities in France. So there's been a big discussion for years now, for 20 years, about changing, about reforming the higher diplomas to teach dance, and including hip hop, all the styles of hip hop, and including them in the higher diplomas to teach dance in conservatories. And so that has been under discussion for a long time. And I think it'll probably go through now because there was a resistance against it by a few years ago. But I think that now that there's a new generation of younger hip hop dancers that I think are favorable to it. A few years ago, the hip hop dancers were against it, and there were discussions with them. This is decided by the ministry. The Ministry of Culture is like the highest institution that sort of bestows legitimacy on things in France, rather than the university. It's the ministry that sort of makes decisions on these matters. And in this case, it would be the Ministry of Culture that creates these diplomas and these degrees, these higher degrees in the realms of music and dance. And they're the ones that organize the conservatories where music and dance is taught. And I remember there was a group of hip hop dancers that were very proud. They had a press conference with the Minister of Culture like 5 or 6 years ago, and and they said that they were against a degree for hip hop dance then. But I think that a younger generation of hip hop dancers now is working with the ministry, and I'm pretty sure that there's going to be a degree for hip hop dance that will be put together pretty soon and this will be probably at the level of a master's or something like that, like 2 or 3 years of college, an equivalent. So it does not yet exist, but it probably will pretty soon.
Yeah, thank you for answering the question I was trying to figure out as I said it out loud. Thank you, Roberta Shapiro, for a wonderful presentation and raising some really, really important points. Alex just had a comment. I'm just going to read it out because sometimes I think the people that watch the recording miss out on so much, but she just said, really interesting to consider how a sport label might slow down an art legitimacy in conservatories. So kind of starting to ask these questions around art and sport that you've raised for us, but how it actually impacts someone's life from a legal standpoint, and also where it fits within different institutions. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. If there's more comments or questions from anyone, feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to move on to our third presenter of today, who's also known to all of you probably already because he's the co-host of this speaker series and one of the co-editors of the special issue that will come out from this research that we've done. We've got Dr. Jason Ang, who is a Cypher postdoctoral research fellow at the University College Cork, where he's researching global hip hop with a focus on dance, media, and cultural production in the Asia Pacific region. His research explores intersections between contemporary music, cultures, media, creative industries, urban geographies, and globalization, and has been published in the journal City, Culture, and Society. He continues to work in the field as an artist in dance, film, and music. And he also wrote a fantastic PhD, so I will throw that in the chat, a link as well for people that want to check out his, his study of multiple years looking at what's going on with breaking in that region. So take it away, Jason.
Thanks, Mary, for the very kind introduction. I might just set up my PowerPoint really quick. Okay, is that all coming through for everyone? Cool. All right. So first of all, thanks to Roberta and Serouj for opening up some really interesting lines of thought, and some of those points that you both brought up, I've given some thought to myself, and especially Serouj, what you're talking about in terms of the longevity of how breaking can leverage their capital position in this negotiation process. I think that's a really interesting question, and my general research interests have really been around that negotiation process, the intermediation of individuals, community leaders, and passionate practitioners who are looking for social, cultural, or even economic outcomes for the cultural community or as Roberta said, to deal with a certain type of precarity that is, you know, pretty typical in full-time dance work. So today I'll be talking about Japan's response to breaking's institutionalization in the Olympics, and be going over some of the, I guess, historical moments, and also, you know, with Japan's general appreciation for hip hop, you know, where it's visible in cultural communities and creative industries, NGOs, government agencies, interests from all these sort of institutional as well as grassroots groups. The work of passionate community leaders and cultural intermediaries seems very critical in navigating these institutional interventions by the WDSF, the IOC, and, you know, and how they sort of manage and deal with that co-option and representation, or how they negotiate representation. So my research, as Mary has touched on, sort of looks at Asia Pacific, but I'm focusing on Japan for this particular case study. And I look at the work of Katsu Ishikawa, Gibor Katsuwan, as to sort of canvas a bit of the work that's already been done, and look at sort of the social and cultural determinants in Japan that have led to some really interesting outcomes that have been generated from his business, from his independent practice, and how that all links up. So I will move on. So just some really basic historical background. Japan has had a really rich history as an alternative center for globalization of inter-Asian global flows of music, television, fashion, art, electronics, music, culture, everything over this last century. And it's been an early adopter of hip hop regionally, and it's maintained this reverence for local hip hop history and tracing lineage back to its origin points. And a lot of the community members reference to me like a hip hop family tree, and Katsu himself regularly refers to this idea of remembering and tracing back that lineage through this hip hop family tree that's in Japan. It's become a really critical node for hip hop culture in the Asia Pacific region, and it's developed and been influential in other Asia Pacific nodes through cultural exports and through the movement of people, and through structuring new projects and pathways for resources, for philanthropy, and for again the movement of people for events or social and cultural outcomes. And of course, Japan has a significant sized hip hop cultural and creative industries, which is comprised of a significantly larger volume of participating dancers compared to other Asia Pacific hubs such as in China, Singapore, and Australia. My research has really always been interested on how these individuals in hip hop culture are working and how they're managing business practices and what external organizations they interface with, and you know, to garner support or to garner resources or to find alternative ways to create things. And I proposed in my PhD that these individuals might be called cross-cultural intermediaries, not only for their cross-cultural capacity and their transnational sort of engagement, but thinking really about how they work between commercial enterprise, state governments, and grassroots cultural communities. And I think, you know, Mary and Cara Jane Lombard have also talked about figures in a similar way, looking at how, you know, there's always kind of been these figures in hip hop culture who have sort of thought about organizing and wanting to do new things by interfacing with external organizations or external interests or funding. Traditional cultural intermediaries were producers of goods and services. They were connectors of communities to enterprises and have traditionally been thought of as creators of new cultural exchanges, opportunities, expressions, and tastemaking in cultural and creative industries. But cross-cultural intermediaries also might be thought of with their reference to cultural and social entrepreneurial abilities, thinking about how they leverage cultural and social networks to their advantage in the creation of new opportunities, new events, new programs. And in hip hop in particular, they work and are appearing in commercial and grassroots, in hip hop, they appear working between commercial, grassroots, and governmental cultures, leveraging their reputation, their networks, cultural capital, within and outside of hip hop culture to create these programs, or, you know, supply social infrastructure, enterprises, events, employment for precarious artists, and ultimately to enhance cultural exchanges. And these cultural agents work at the intersection of local hip hop forms and international flows as well. And that's really the interest that I've had in canvassing the Asia Pacific hip hop sort of idea, because I feel like there's this idea that everything stems from one side of the world, where there's actually this really rich interconnected network of practitioners, community leaders that are engaging in cultural entrepreneurship, social activism, are interfacing with philanthropic sort of organizations, corporations, government bodies, and thinking of really interesting strategic ways to create sustainable businesses, events, etc. And my previous work sort of looked at that in a comparative lens, which Mary mentioned before. And cultural intermediation is something I'm, by way of social entrepreneurship, is something I'm particularly interested in, as it positions social outcomes as its focus rather than an economic outcome of typical entrepreneurship. So how to leverage and work in these conversations between institutions and culture to create social outcomes, but they also have, the potential to stimulate economic support for practitioners as an offshoot of that. The very work of doing social entrepreneurship, that practice becomes more sustainable. The prominent communitarian ethos around hip hop makes social entrepreneurship particularly fitting as a pathway for hip hop intermediaries working in the Asia Pacific cultural and creative industries. Hip hop's communitarian embrace also complements social entrepreneurial practices in the region that align with norms of Confucian filial piety and collectivism. And further, it sees individuals apply this type of business logic to their experience of the field and make use of their position amongst their networks to instigate change for and via socially oriented projects. This type of work often aligns with social outcomes of cultural policy and take for example, the creation of social infrastructure for at-risk or marginalized youth, which makes their work particularly attractive to governments and easy to parlay for funding for that matter. And this research I'm doing on the Olympics really looks at trying to get down to cultural intermediation in Japan and how that's benefited from social entrepreneurship in relation to, the Olympic moment, really. Like, what opportunities have they been able to create, and how does the support of corporate and state intervention brokered by these intermediaries threaten, complement, or obviously complicate local global hip hop culture from Japan? To do so, I'm using a mixed methodology approach. I draw on a lot of ethnography already conducted for my PhD, but I've sort of tried to develop that with keeping interviews up with my case study. I've done another sort of big dive into archival research, looking at translations that I've conducted for over 50 documents, which span federal cultural policy documents, press releases, newspaper articles, organizational documents, and other forms of public testimony. And I also use digital ethnography or internet discourse analysis on social media to sort of see how cultural communities are responding and positioning themselves, in response to these sort of movements of cultural intermediaries around the world. And this method kind of falls into a case study and forms a social history around a type of social entrepreneurship that's enabling an organized response to the Olympics in Japan and highlights significant social, cultural, and economic outcomes for the cultural communities from Tokyo. So just to introduce Katsu, B-Boy Katsuwan is a practitioner. He's been working with hip hop culture for a long time. He's been a practitioner since 1990s and built his reputation through a community first type of leadership and this ongoing global participation as a practitioner, really. Yeah, as a B-Boy, like still traveling, still getting down, still doing all the, putting in work at battles and getting down in ciphers. He's a key intermediary in Japan as well through his social entrepreneurial endeavors via his company IAM. He's also become the executive director of Japan's Dance Sport Federation Breaking Division and the Japan Olympic Committee Breaking dedicated coach. One example of how his social entrepreneurship has been utilized in the past to provide social solutions for the cultural community that he services is through the development of his studio, We Are. While there's a commercial element to that, it was initially designed to support the practicing communities that gather at one of Japan's and perhaps one of Asia Pacific's most famous hip hop geographies, Musashi Mizunokuchi Station in Kawasaki City. Local dancers have gathered there for over 3 decades at night to practice and build, and this location has seen a number of international practitioners gather on a weekly basis, at least pre-COVID. And this was really because there was a number of complaints by local citizens, conservative citizens, who have had a complex relationship with breaking in Japan because of the Fueiho law, which is really limited the ways that breaking could appear in public spaces like clubs where music was happening, which has relegated it to the street or in private. And when it's been practiced on the street traditionally, the response has been fairly for lack of a better word, a conservative response that's born out of this fear of the subversive idea that it's betraying that old historical paradigm. And that law was only lifted in 2016. Another example of his social entrepreneurship and intermediation through this project is developing a hip-hop kids camp, which establishes social infrastructure for youth across Japan. It offers mentorship alongside skills building activities, and provides a social network for the kids to sort of rely on, this sort of hip-hop network where when there's an event across the country, you can sort of pick up and hang out with a friend, and there's this camaraderie. And those networks also become incredibly important in structuring these cultural and social businesses in the future. They are the partners that you want in your business because they're from the community. So he does pass on this idea as well, tacitly almost. His social enterprise does lead to two interesting outcomes. One is that it does offer some remuneration to participants to deal with that general precarity that, again, Roberta highlighted before. And secondly, it tends to social infrastructure for the youth that's garnered support from the government. And this has really set a favorable foundation in Kawasaki for the preceding work to be done in the response to the Olympic moment. So before breaking debuted at the Youth Olympic Games, there was, obviously a lot of confusion around the process, around the Olympic bid, who has control over the institutional process with the World Dance Sport Federation, and Katsu was concerned about the control of Japan's Dance Sports Federation and by proxy the World Dance Sport Federation as having, their control over the future of breaking, with the bid to the IOC transpiring with little oversight or awareness from the global cultural community. As an experienced intermediary, though, I think this really presented an opportunity for cultural community intervention. And he did note the futility of doing so in a recent interview, saying, "I hear that if you do something without going through them, the World Dance Sport Federation, it still happens." So even if there was this process of ignoring it, he knows that the outcome without, intervention could be worse. In his original meetings with the JDSF, he found that they were particularly responsive to suggestion, willing to implement change and engage cultural community leaders like himself to work with them and enhance their cultural representation of breaking and its history, and also provide other outcomes for the community. Social entrepreneurs as intermediaries like Katsu also typically recognize these opportunities from this type of communication and intervention, thinking of how to broker support for other social cultural outcomes that sit outside this initial partnership. To service, community needs. And in 2018, he was appointed the JDSF Breaking Division Director. To garner further support for cultural community engagement, he delivered a number of lectures on hip-hop culture and the potentials for coexistence with the sport categorization, looking to existing paradigms from external organizations like Red Bull BC1 for comparison. And he also traveled around the country out of pocket to try and gain support through direct advocacy to communities and community leaders across Japan. And these attempts at advocacy have prompted, I think, a general idea and a recognition of the capital position that breaking is in, the need from the IOC and dance sport federations for this to go well. And at least in Japan, that can be used in their favor in negotiating resources. It can provide distinct cultural, economic, and social outcomes, which I'll touch on later. And this campaigning for support has also aligned with this ongoing message and idea that his work as an intermediary is really about, if we can make the money through the sports sort of division, wouldn't it be great if we could bring that to the culture and do something for the kids, the next generation? And he always proposes, how can we actually use this money that we earn for the children and for the culture? And I think that message is something that he's consistently reprised in all of our interactions. So Youth Olympic Game qualifiers and emerging support. In the lead up to the Youth Olympic Games, he worked with Mayor Fukuda from Kawasaki City to set up the World Dance Sport Federation World Championships ahead of the Youth Olympic Games. Kawasaki City government also invested in and hosted an annual international street cultural festival, which features Katsu's event Super Break that supports younger dancers with exclusive age brackets. And major media has really responded favorably to breaking and Kawasaki's centrality to hip-hop culture in Japan, with major newspapers, Asahi, Yomiuri, Sankai, and Nikkei Japan Times all talking about breaking hip-hop cultural history and thinking about those connections in the public sphere. Some reprised hip-hop's cultural history and breaking's origins ahead of any mention of sports, which was really interesting, and others explored its local roots and important urban geographies, framing Mizunokuchi Station as a sacred place or mecca for breaking and hip-hop culture in Japan. This has noticeably changed cultural attitudes towards public dance, which is really interesting, with supporting cultural citizenry, buying sports drinks, or coming up and responding enthusiastically rather than going to the police and getting them to usher them out of the station. And official government documentation around Tokyo and the Olympics, the official government documentation around the Tokyo Olympics period noted the importance of street as a place for dance in an effort to create support for the movement of breaking into the Olympics in the 2024 Olympic Games. And following the Youth Olympic Games, breaking is mentioned in governmental cultural policy for the first time in history in Kawasaki City and by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology. And it's opened a formal discourse that's directly related to city funding for sports and cultural and creative industries, which I think Mary just mentioned before is happening in Canada as well, which is, it's quite peculiar considering it's one of the few art forms that would see this two-pronged strategy. And in Kawasaki City, specifically, where Mizunokuchi Station, the sacred place for hip-hop culture, has been referenced, the mayor has approved a 4.5 million yen development of a new youth cultural center as part of the new town development policy. Kawasaki has also developed formal governmental ambassadorial titles awarded to local dancers in the region, offering new types of legitimization that they can leverage to their advantage in different formal settings, and also dignifies their work with a different type of mainstream appeal, I think, not for themselves within hip-hop culture, but if they were to communicate their dance practice as full-time practitioners outwardly to other mainstream organizations, and it offers them a way in to do that interfacing and intermediary work themselves. And surrounding the Kawasaki City Town Hall to celebrate the city's youth cultural focus, they erected a 100-meter aerosol art mural depicting hip-hop in practice, which is just really interesting as a development from having, being ushered out of a station as a cultural community to having this immense support and funding and opportunities being presented. But yeah, so just to return to what questions I set out to answer, how does the work of cultural communities really impact, or how have they really negotiated opportunities from breaking in the Olympics? Social entrepreneurship is shown here to be a critical modality for hip-hop cultural work in Japan and has been instrumental in negotiating certain outcomes from interfacing with the government, the JDSF, and cultural community, such as changing cultural attitudes towards breaking amongst a conservative citizenry, establishing government support for the Olympic effort, as well as new cultural events, influencing the representation of hip-hop and breaking culture in the JDSF or from the JDSF, establishing new pathways for legitimization, providing more economic stimulus to support hip-hop cultural work within the sports paradigm and outside of it by way of cultural and creative industries. And returning to the second question, which was about, the effect of this intervention from corporate and state organizations if it threatens or complements local and global hip-hop cultural development. I mean, it's a really complicated question. I'd like to think that at very least there are some positives that have come from this process and all of Katsu's hard work. But of course, there's a potential for it to be in decline. Like Serouj said, these organizations are in decline. The sustainability may not be as sustainable as we think. But at very least, there are some cultural and social wins here, and made possible by this process of intermediation and social entrepreneurship in Japan. But yeah, what the future holds for this whole process is kind of unknown, and calls for more work on the impacts of post-Paris 2024 analysis. And yeah, anyway, that's pretty much it for me. I hope that was insightful in some way and shed a bit of light onto Katsu's example. He's here as well, listening in, so I'm sure he'll be around to answer any questions as well. But yeah.
Great, thank you so much for sharing your research, Jason. Do we have questions or comments? You can either throw them in the chat or raise your hand here, and I'll try to catch it on the 2 pages. Oh, we've already seen what happens when I just freestyle a question off the cuff. You want to see some more? We've got Jaspel's got a question, thankfully. Jaspel?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Serouj, and thanks, Roberta, for these really cool talks. Really enjoyed them. My question is really to Jason. Sorry, I've got a baby here. It's a bit loud.
No worries.
My question is really to Jason and perhaps even to Katsu, if Katsu is here, and if he wants to answer that question. In terms of authenticity from the community, right? Is there a risk when you become a cultural intermediary that you sort of lose the reputation in the community on the street, as it were? If you could reflect on this question, that would be really cool. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, it's a really great question. I think there's a number of examples where it's worked in that way, and I think it really depends on how where your standing is, and I guess a big part of it is how much of your effort is actually focused on what you propose you're going to do. You know, I mean, I think a lot of intermediaries set out to do something and get carried away with the idea of economics being the bottom line for them at some point, and I think that's a really risky trajectory for cultural intermediation. That's a risk of all cultural intermediaries. You know, I think the other side of that is, though, you know, some of this organization and that negotiating work is really difficult, and it requires like code switching and a savviness that a lot of other people might not have. And I think for cultural communities who are looking to develop outcomes, and that's not going to please everyone, of course, but for people who are interested in developing new outcomes and new possibilities and opportunities, I think it lends them a type of legitimacy and authenticity in a way, because it aligns their practice with something that's commonly felt, and it also aligns their practice with something that's socially organized and socially relevant and provides a value that's both cultural and social in a different way, as well as economics. But yes, there's still a fulcrum there that can be risky. I hear that.
Great. And Katsu, do you want to add anything? Or if not, I can just see if there's any other questions or comments. Emil, do you want to jump in with your comment, or I can read it out as well? He's just saying that it's interesting how we, the practitioners, take it on ourselves to expand breaking participation out of our passion for the dance versus the Olympic silence on the assistance to expansion and inclusivity.
Absolutely. But I feel like that trajectory has kind of been pretty typical, you know, and it kind of goes back to the idea that historically, for the most part, there's been a complication with the extractive practices of corporations, more corporations than governments, because I think governments have are less interested in sort of leveraging hip hop imagery. I mean, some do for city building purposes, of course, but yeah, it is an interesting, you know, trend, I guess, that extends back to the 80s as well, with impresario work and things like that. You know, it's difficult. It's always practitioners who are sort of in that interfacing role. Not always, but, you know.
I guess this is a comment then. Starting as a comment, maybe I'll generate a question or not through it. But I'm just, it reminds me of, you know, when I was in Nantes, France in, maybe it was in 2008, doing work on HipHop Obsessions, which is, you know, another international competition that was, you know, funded by the French government and this kind of thing. I remember talking to local b-boys, and there was a clear sense, the local b-boys to that specific area and region that gathered and danced there, that they really felt used in the beginning, in the origin of it, when, you know, the people that want to start to invest in breaking were asking them for their opinions and consulting. And as soon as they kind of met, say, more of international figures and that kind of thing, they pushed them aside, right? They didn't need them anymore. So there was a feeling of, definitely at the local level, of feeling extracted that their resources and consulting wasn't really appreciated, and then they were kind of kicked out. So I guess this is maybe a question for all three before we open it up to our respondent, Miduss, Jason, Roberta, in terms of how does this project of the Olympics tie in with maybe conversations we could have been having about other events, Red Bull, hip hop session, any other of these kind of corporate interests that have come into breaking, and we haven't really had those conversations about them, but we definitely have them about the academy and about the Olympics, right? This thread of others. So how do you feel in terms of the relationship between events that have already come into community? Have they done a better job? Is that why they're not questioned in the same way? Or do you think that there have been those questions around these other institutional involvements? Or I guess my kind of skepticism might be around, why don't breakers talk about corporate brands that have come in with the same kind of critiques that they have for this kind of amateur sport institution of the Olympics or higher education, education institutions? Why isn't that question coming up about these other institutes? Any thoughts from anyone?
Well, I'll just jump in there, freestyle, pass the mic. I'll freestyle a little bit too. I mean, it's just kind of a very important question. I think it's valid. I think people should question everything. I mean, nothing's off limits, especially if you're, again, like a hip hop head or a b-boy, a b-girl. I mean, why would you be afraid to question Red Bull Olympics? I mean, I think we have a history in the dance that should teach us a lesson. This dance got exploited to the point that it died in North America, at least. And it's like, that experience is, I think, foremost on my mind when thinking about a lot of these questions. I think, if, again, very anecdotally, this isn't something I've researched in depth or anything, but in the 80s, you had a lot of practitioners who just stayed silent. They knew a lot of that stuff that was happening was culturally not accurate or doing justice to what they were involved in, but they stayed silent, because of the opportunity, because of the precarity, and so on and so forth. So I think when it comes to the 90s, that was definitely something that at least was in the ether as far as discourse and narrative. Again, perception, I think, is what I would return to. And there's the question that's interesting to me. With Red Bull and these other things, I haven't studied that to know what the negotiations were or what the narrative behind that was. But with the Olympics, which I have focused on more, I mean, the narrative is somewhat concerning. The narrative of, we can't do anything. The train has left the station. This is a great opportunity. We'll be legitimate. I think it's interesting to compare breaking narrative, like in that frame, to skateboarding narrative or surfing narrative or parkour narrative, which is not, we can't do anything, at all. So I think that's an interesting question as a researcher and as a practitioner, is why is this narrative in community so focused on, let's win-win, let's not rock the boat, that's, I think that's not a value judgment against that narrative. It's really to try to understand it, because I think there is issues of class, race, other things related to that. How certain communities respond one way, other communities take a different approach, and in similar situations. So I think that comparative lens is interesting for that reason. But I think it would be interesting to compare the Olympics situation to the Red Bull situation. What's similar, what's different, what can we learn from that, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I haven't done that research myself.
I can't, the camera isn't working here. There it is. Hi. I haven't done enough interviews to answer with much assurance about the Olympics, but but I have the impression that the general acceptance of the Olympics is the overwhelming awe of what Olympics represents. Olympics represents universalism, and the idea that the whole world is watching, even if, as Serouj says, it may be on the decline, but everyone doesn't realize that. You have to really look into it and do research to know that. Not everybody has this, not everybody knows that it's in decline. It still has great prestige, and it does have the prestige of universalism and the idea that everyone, the whole world, will be watching. So I think that critique is likely to be not as strong because of this great prestige and the idea that the whole world is watching, and it's a great opportunity. This is my idea, but I have not done enough. I haven't talked to enough people to answer with certainty. So this is what
I think that is a really good contribution.
Yeah.
And just being a bit mindful of time, I'm going to move on to our respondent. I'm so excited to be introducing Professor Imani Kai-Johnson, who I'm sure everyone who's been paying attention the last couple of years knows has done huge contributions and interventions into the field of hip hop studies through her research on breaking. I've popped her bio into the chat so that you can look up a bit more about her, but basically we've invited her to act as a respondent today to some of the talks and comment a little bit. So Imani, take it away.
Thanks for the intro. It's probably way inflated. It's super early here, trying to get my brain to work. And I've not really been involved in the breaking conversations. So this was really helpful for me to hear just the intricacies and the nuances that the research produces. So I have very brief comments. I feel like there's already questions, so the conversation can kind of continue on whether I say anything or not, but it feels important to at least clarify that I am definitely among those who has a bit of a mournful response to breaking in the Olympics. Like ultimately, this, whatever the change is, there's a kind of inevitableness. That things are going to change, period, right? However, whatever that change looks like. So this research gave me some room to appreciate just how intricate those kinds of changes would manifest, the very real material consequences. I mean, I hadn't even thought about what are your taxes gonna look like when you shift from one to the other, especially in a context where your government might actually pay you versus here where I don't think that's not the case. Thinking about the possibilities of shaping things culturally, which I remain deeply skeptical of, but hearing about both, thinking through the lens of, say, social entrepreneurship and thinking about what it means to really shape how culture, like a cultural practice can live in the Olympics, and what that leverage can be. There's something in that is potentially very powerful, but it's also very limited. It's very temporary. This is a moment, this moment of transition where that leverage can be activated in a certain kind of way before enough legitimacy has been reached where they can discard whatever consulting organizations exist or discard whatever intermediaries have a certain place that, as was just mentioned, that it's the room to discard the local folks who are needed right now, once that need has been met. Historically speaking, that's a thing that repeats itself. So we also can't pretend that doesn't have a factor. And so I feel like a lot of my concerns then are it's not even at this point, I don't even know if concerns is the right word. At this point, it's really thinking about what then are the consequences of that generationally. We have a sense of I feel like coming out of these talks, I have a sense of just the multitude of things that are being negotiated and juggled with and contemplated right now and how people live, how they move forward, how they carry their practice through to these different venues, and thinking about the Olympics and this sports branch of things. And I'm part of what I'm I guess sitting with is a kind of angle that echoes something Roberta mentioned, which is like that question around professionalization, like what does that look like in the day-to-day? How are you seeing yourself? How are you engaging with others? That to me has a generational impact. What does it mean at the point where there's, generation of kids coming up for whom this is all breaking is and will ever be? That part is a thing that I linger with, and it's not a question I can ask because we're at this point of transition, and breaking wasn't always competition driven. So then that was its own point of transition that produced its own set of questions and concerns. And so and just having been teaching lately, thinking about students coming into dance studies courses now, and their main relationship to dance is, what's it called? So you think you can dance. That's their main relationship to dance. In previous generations, when I would teach, their main relationships of dance and pop culture was like Save the Last Dance. So I just wonder about like what that impact is generationally. What the implications of that are when it can become a professional track for athletes. I linger on questions of culture, and I guess I'm curious about what that influence can be. Because in my head, cultural historical references to hip hop become just kind of symbolic representations in an Olympic context. Like in the same way dance sport, gestures towards certain kind of Latin roots and aspects of dance sport by hyper tanning and like really lowering the shirt. Like these are these kinds of, symbolic references that have kind of no substance to them. I worry about the implications of that kind of thing. But really, I feel like what everybody's discussions have brought out are the questions that I haven't been grappled with. Like, what can that leverage look like? Can that leverage shift how the Olympics deals with athletes, especially if we're in a position to name kind of necessary components so that it's not like an Olympic event of acrobatics to really whack beats because you can't get clearance on good music or something. Like I'm just curious about what the implications are and how those implications live and become a kind of common sense understanding of what breaking is to future generations. So these aren't really questions. I have no idea if I'm actually adding anything to the conversation, but that's my little 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And any response from the panelists, anything you're thinking about, we can open it up now for a bit more conversation. And I will, sorry.
There were a couple of comments in the chat that hadn't been addressed yet from Vincent Q, and Emil had his hand up before I talked, so.
Yeah, let me.
For sure.
Yeah, Emil's got his kids with him, so he said he'll return to the discussion next week because we didn't get to his question. I don't know. Yeah, he's taking them out for the day. So we've got some childcare going on as well today. Jason, I'll pass it over to you. And I'm just going to throw in the chat also Imani's new book that she's co-edited, the Oxford Handbook of Hip-Hop Dance Studies, which shows you the kind of activism she's doing as well. I'll just throw that in. Jason, take it away.
Yeah, thanks for your response, Imani. I think we're all kind of where you're at in a way, sort of trying to grapple with the immensity of what this problem, or maybe not problem, but this new moment brings. And one thing that you mentioned was how it impacts culture. And I'm kind of more, I'm interested in thinking about that from maybe a slightly different angle, which is how hip hop is enabled through changing cultural attitudes towards hip hop rather than the the idea of parents in Japan not allowing their children to be dancers or to participate in dance practice because it was seen as subversive from the 70s to the early 2000s. And I like that there's someone like Katsu who has, I don't know what you would say, but like has been super involved in hip hop cultural development in Asia and is really trying to shift those cultural attitudes, and while also making sure that there's a historical element that's being represented at the same time. And I'm not saying that that's the ultimate solution or anything, but I think that there are interesting cultural shifts in these national cultures around this, for lack of a better word, this legitimating moment for breaking in its institutional form. But I don't know how long they will live. I will say, though, that the intervention of state government is interesting, though, because I think investment and recognition from government, which has a far less complex history compared to perhaps corporate intervention like Red Bull, perhaps, corporations and corporate power has traditionally been a site of mass exploitation in the past in hip hop culture. I just think that the state's involvement in Japan and the idea that they're trying to create all these pathways for funding and opportunities for dancers and events and social infrastructure that implements these practices at least enables it in some way. And it may not be the best way, but it gives it a different breathing room that it didn't have before. And yeah, anyway, sorry, I'm just kind of rambling on here. I also don't know the answer to any of my questions.
That's a good segue because Vincent, I don't know if you want to jump in with your comments here, but Vincent, do you want to ask some of your or make some of your comments? Vincent Q.
Sorry, I'm in between work meetings, so I cannot.
Okay, let me read it out. But first of all, let me just say, Vincent's doing really interesting work collecting data on breaking battles. So he started a really interesting research project. So if anyone else is interested in data collection about international competitions, definitely reach out to him. But his question here has to do with he put two comments. I'll just read them both. The first says, question and pardon if my preconceived notions are inaccurate, but have you noticed any particular nuances in hip hop and breaking's reception in Japanese mainstream society, given that the culture is inherently rebellious, whereas Japan has rigid and traditional social costumes? If I break them up, yeah.
I can speak to that a little bit. I think that there's a number of writing that sort of considers this. Condry considers this, and a number of other scholars in Japan have considered this same question about where it fits within traditional social customs and the normative ideology, and how that tension comes about and how it comes to bear on the way that hip hop cultural practices are performed in Japan, and how they're made possible. I will say that there are interesting developments with the sort of media response around breaking in the Olympics, where we've seen a shift from the media framing breaking as a derivative of gang culture as a negative thing, to being part of a tradition that is connected to this, even if that narrative isn't entirely accurate or has been misrepresented, or it's, whatever that element has now shifted, where I think one of the, I think it was Asahi Shimbun, which is one of the largest newspapers in Japan. The headline was like 1970s gang dance or something, hip hop culture, something. But it basically reports on this whole cultural history of, from Black Spades to Savage Nomads, and sort of rolling through this culture, the hip hop cultural development, and then at the very bottom it gets to the Olympics. So it's just interesting to see that those pieces are out there as well, and those are repositioning those negative stereotypes and the negative sort of perceptions of what hip hop culture was in Japan, and what made, that was, I guess, ostensibly confrontational or subversive to conservative citizens, or traditional or maybe at odds with traditional cultural customs. But yeah, I think things are slowly changing, and whether that's for the better or the worse right now, it's hard to know. But I think that it's interesting to see these shifts in the way that organizations around it are positioning it as well. I don't know if that made sense.
And I'll move on to Natalia's question. Natalia, you're here. I can read it out for you unless you jump in. Her question is in line with Imani's considerations. She was wondering what might be the impact. Oh, Natalia, do you want to take it away?
Yes, no problem. My question is, I was wondering what might be the impact of the participation in the Olympics with regard to gendered performativities and women's feminist emancipations or queer, I don't know, emancipations. I'm wondering, I haven't followed the previous discussions, but I don't know if gender is implicated with this participation in the Olympics. I don't know if you have to comment or elaborate on this issue.
That could be really for anyone on the panel in terms of your
yeah. It addresses to anyone. I mean,
yeah. Does anyone have any thinking in your own research projects about it, or does that factor into the work that you're doing?
Well, I can't speak about the breaking situation. I mean, breaking is obviously new, right? It's like it hasn't actually even gone through the full Summer Games process. We have Youth Olympics experience to look at, but looking at the other, sports. And the reason I hesitate to use sports, again, just to kind of sidetrack for a second, is the Olympics isn't even wanting to call this a sport. They're trying to emphasize culture, and I think when I talk about perception, I think that is an interesting thing too. We should look at, it's natural to think, okay, Olympic sports, but they're basically trying to do a rebranding, and trying to introduce culture. So we as a cultural movement, a dance, we should not put that aside. I mean, that could be a reason for us not to panic so much and to use that talking point for our own advantage if we're interested in like maintaining artistic integrity and expression. I just reiterate that because the perceptions on our side too, like we have perceptions in our community that might not correspond all the time with reality. So, but again, to go back to the gender thing, there hasn't been too much research about this whole Agenda 2020 process in regards to these activities being brought in. Most of the research has been about questions of Agenda 2020 in relation to like gentrification, corruption, sustainability, those questions, not really the youth activities being brought in. But there are two scholars that have done some work. One of them, her name is Holly Thorpe, another one, Belinda Wheaton, and their analysis of surfing, skateboarding, these other forms in regard to the gender question is they call Agenda 2020 a performance of change. So they talk about it as not being fully serious in the sense of structural change. They talk about how a lot of sport, already the Olympics is quite close to 50% parity, and they're just going further with it, which is great. But they kind of take note of where it is and where it's going and how it's not a, and they point to issues like differences in rules between men's and women's sports, how that's a question for a lot of participants, sponsorship and money distribution, decision-making power, equity and equality on that level. Those are the questions they point to as being of substance, and how this doesn't really address that, and that's why they call it performance of change. So that doesn't mean they discount that attempt and those efforts, but they point out how for the IOC a lot of this seems, and they actually were sponsored by the IOC to do their research, so they had very close interviews in their work. They describe it as a chore, a PR branding exercise, something that is being done to bring in revenue and other things, so that it's not fully addressing like core issues as far as they're concerned, but yet nevertheless significant, nevertheless. So yeah, I don't know what to say beyond that. That's my limited kind
of. Can I say a few words about this? I haven't delved much into the gender issue myself. All I can say is that on the French breaking team, I can't remember precisely, but I think they're like 2 or 3 women and 15 men. Obviously, it's the same proportion that you find in other instances, much less women than men. I'm a bit surprised by what Serouj had to say, because about not the breakers not being athletes, but being in the realm of culture. In any case, on the website of the French Dance Federation, you have, there's a breaking commission, there's a subset of for breakers on the French Federation, and they're well defined as athletes, high-level athletes, according to the sports code and the high-level charter, the high-level sports charter. They're defined as high-level athletes. So that's the French Dance Federation that says that. I don't know about the IOC, how they define them, but so that's under discussion, whether how people are defined.
Yeah, if I could just quickly say, I mean, that's what I'm trying to say, is that it's under negotiation, discussion, and these are the things that people, I mean, what I'm pointing to is Agenda 2020, the recommendation that says we want to mix culture and sport. I mean, even this recent announcement that they're doing qualifiers with just BMX, skateboarding, breaking. I mean, they're doing that to promote culture and urbanism. This is the words they're using. So I'm taking the IOC's narrative, the Agenda 20, with the dance sport world, what you're quoting, that's a whole different conversation, which I haven't touched on, but there's an effort and a perception behind those terms in the ballroom world, which they don't want to be looked at as a recreational activity. They're sport, they're athletes, they train. This is their way of trying to instill legitimacy. They believe in the name sport. They called ballroom dance sport in the 80s. So we as practitioners, we don't call our dance a sport ever, you know. And I think another kind of quick thing I'll put out there, I think it's commendable how practitioners change the terminology from breakdancing to breaking for the Olympics. I think that also points to what I'm referring to as far as leverage, not accepting their imposition on us, but to us have some cultural autonomy, some integrity, and maintain these principles that make our dance, this cultural movement, significant in people's lives. So yeah, like the terminology is definitely in negotiation. I'm not trying to say anything like concrete. It varies.
That this is not central to our discussion, but I want to take the occasion that you introduced the word breakdancing to say a word about how the word is used in France. When the word breaking was introduced recently, and the French were very troubled by that. Breaking does not pass well at all in France. Nobody wants to use that word. And people say, well, we've been saying breakdance for 40 years. Why do you tell us to say breaking? And I know breakdance is obviously taboo in the United States. You're not supposed to say breakdance. It's the bad word. You're supposed to say b-boying. But nobody knows about that argument in France. It's an American discussion. In France, nobody knows about this whole controversy, this debate. And the French are used to say breakdance. And I think it's because it has the word dance in it. And dance is an important thing. And the French say breakdance. And a year ago, no, 2 years ago, in 2019, the World Dance Sport Federation put out an Instagram post saying, don't say breakdance, you're supposed to say breaking. And it didn't last, it lasted a month and they took it down because people said, what are you talking about? We say breakdance, leave us alone, kind of thing. And even the officials, the Olympic executives in their press announcements, the French ones, when they make public statements, they say breakdance and they say, oh no, oh sorry, breakdance, breaking. Pardon. They say, and that's the way people speak in France. So it's interesting to see how in each country, I mean, each country has their own way of saying things, doing things, and they have their own history. And even if it's an international, a global community, it's also, there are also local communities that have their own way of doing things, their own history, and their own debates. So that's a parenthesis to our general discussion, but I thought it would be interesting to tell you about it. Right.
I know I want to understand what the Olympics thinks they're saying, what the IOC thinks they're saying, or what they think they mean by bringing in culture. Most of the world sees this as in relationship to sport, regardless of whatever language they use, and culture, if they're performing a certain change for an audience, but not actually undergoing one. What does that actually look like? What does that mean? How does it play out in what we're going to actually see on the screen? Or is it just lip service to the language of culture? And then if there is room to kind of leverage that culture angle, what that can look like, what that can mean, especially for people who are organizing, who are thinking about how to funnel money back into working with youth and amplifying a direction for breaking that isn't